So first thing that I need to get right here is pronouncing your name. So it's Jayesh Ashwaramoni.
Ishwaramoni.
Ishwaramoni.
Yeah.
See, we were practicing this before we started, and I'm still getting it wrong. Yeah. So Jayesh is the SVP and MD of InMobi for Asia Pacific, Middle East, and Africa.
Yeah.
But what is it exactly that you do?
Okay, so I run, so I've been with InMobi for last 6 years. So my role covers everything from revenues to managing the profitability to new partnerships and developing regions. So pretty much like any MD would do. Right. So either you can assume that I do a lot of things or I do nothing. So
and how many years have you been at InMobi?
Yeah, so 6 years.
6 years at InMobi, yeah. And prior to that you were 6 years at Forrester.
Yeah, Frost & Sullivan.
Frost & Sullivan.
As a consultant and analyst, yeah.
So consultant turned SVP handling sales, basically.
Yeah.
Right, very good. So, I've got my notes on my phone here, so I don't think I'm trying to tweet while we're having a conversation, which I'll try. This is a fantastic topic for this year. Everyone's talking about ad fraud, but in a way, this is not new, right? We've seen this for the last few decades. From the moment we started seeing ads getting sold, there have always been ways to basically create fraudulent impressions or eyeballs. So why is this year different?
Yeah, I think it's more to do with the maturity that we are seeing in the industry. Like if you really look at mobile advertising, it took off around 2013, 2014, when actually Facebook entered the game, right? And we have seen 3 to 4 years of a very strong shift towards mobile advertising, right? And I think this is where I would say that it's a sign of maturity of the industry is one angle. The second is that there were a lot of high-profile incidents this year, right?
FT for one.
Yeah, FT, yeah. And then there was an incident in Vietnam where an ad was seen next to anti-government propaganda, and people moved money out of platforms like YouTube. There's been a lot of debate around viewability, where PNG, the CMO of PNG has been on record saying, we will buy only viewable impressions. So I think I would put it under the larger umbrella term of accountability in advertising, and especially mobile advertising. And the fraud part exists more rampantly as the industry size increases, right? So when you are a $100 billion potential industry, you'll obviously have people trying to make money out of it.
Right, so you see accountability and ad fraud to be somewhat different, or are they the same issue with a different lens applied?
So I think the accountability part is across 4 dimensions, right? So one is ad fraud, which is completely wrong, right? So for example, people are doing domain spoofing, they are doing click spamming, they are giving you the wrong installs. So if you're an app download company, you wanted installs in, say, China, but you are getting installs in Hong Kong, or and things like that. So that is a lot of fraudulent practices which is linked to click and install fraud, which is where a lot of fraud happens in mobile advertising. And that is because of several things like click injection, wrong URLs, and so on and so forth. So that is one part, which is ad fraud, which you have said you will give an install of XYZ, or you'll give a certain amount of clicks, but you've done all the wrong things. So that's ad fraud in my opinion, and that's fully fraud. Then there is viewability, which is more to do with an interpretation of an impression, right? So there is an MRC definition of viewability, which means that when your ad loads, it should be viewable for at least 50% of the pixels should be seen for 1 second. And if it's a video ad, it should be 2 seconds, right? So that is more about, so if you take the industry 4 years before, people were, so long as I served an ad, I could bill for it, right? And that was how the industry was doing it. And then it moved towards rendered ads, and now it is moving towards viewable ads. So it's a kind of but I think viewability has become a big debate, especially because some of the larger platforms don't support it in the same way as MRC defines it, right? So viewability has become a big problem for marketeers, especially FMCG advertisers who are doing video, right? And there's a big difference between, say, mobile web, where the viewability is very poor, or desktop, where it is only 45%, whereas, for example, in InMobi, we are able to do 90% plus viewability. So viewability is a different stack.
Right.
And then there is brand safety, which means that, like, for example, as an advertiser, is your ad being shown against a porn site or an anti-government site, and there are gray areas, right? Should cigarettes be being seen by a child and so on? So that's more about brand safety.
Okay.
And then the fourth is around attribution, which is a very different ball game. So I think the industry gets a bit confused between saying, oh, everything is fraud or everything. I mean, I think these three buckets are very distinct.
Right.
Right, and they all require different kinds of problems to be solved.
Okay. So let's go back to viewability for a little bit. So how would you define that?
So we follow the MRC definition because that's the only industry definition. Which is if it's a display ad, the ad 50% of the pixels should be seen for 1 second. Okay. And if it's a video ad, it should be seen for 2 seconds.
Right, and where does that definition fall apart?
So I think different other companies have come up with their own definitions, right? So GroupM has their own definition. Some of like Facebook has debated the definition, and I think that debate happens because there are different kinds of formats. So if it's a simple display banner, it is viewable. I mean, the definition is standard.
Sure.
But for something which is like a scrolling format where you're not going to probably you're just scrolling. Right?
Facebook, for example.
Yeah. So then, is the ad viewable or not is a debate.
Right.
So I think it's also a bit of format dependent or user environment dependent, right? But I think there's no point people having a different definition, just by the nature of format, because then the industry doesn't come together.
Sure. So apart from the likes of, say, GroupM, do other agencies care at all about how this stuff is being, defined?
No, I think there are agency definitions. I think GroupM is the only one who has come up with their own, as far as I know. But I think there are third-party players like Moat and IAS who are the verification partners. So I think the agency is basically following what the advertiser wants them to do. So if the advertiser is very keen to buy only viewable impressions, they support that. And I think agencies want the industry to be a more transparent and fair ecosystem.
Sure. And you can't be at a conference like this and not talk about Facebook and Google, right?
Yes.
So what is the
I think
role
somebody
of
called it, I forget the name, Gooface.
Gooface or, let's see.
Yeah, Fugly. I don't know.
Fugl.
Yeah.
So what is the role of these two companies in establishing standards and enforcement or regulation?
So I think, firstly, they need to be verifiable, right? I think what the industry is asking them to do is to be third-party verifiable on all accounts.
You're third-party verified as well, right?
Yes, as in Mobi, we work with Moat, IAS, Nielsen for all third-party. So one is for third-party verification across all parts, right? Whether it is for tracking of app downloads, which is a one part, for viewability and for audience measurement. And I think what the benefit Google and Facebook have is that they can do a lot of self-attribution today because they are the largest players.
Right.
And that is not available to everyone. And so that's where the industry has to come together, or they need to debate whether is this fair, just because they are the duopoly and they are so dominant, is that the right thing to do?
And even for them, there are conflicting views between the two of them.
Yeah, yes, because they're two different platforms, right? I mean, one is a social platform, one is a search and video platform predominantly. So it's different. And then there is also there are differences in the way you do it, right? As I said, there's a format level dependency. There's also different attribution techniques as well, right? So that also adds to the complication. But I think everybody needs to play. I mean, I think the standard practice of you grading your own homework is not acceptable, right?
That's a great analogy.
Yeah, so I think that's what the industry wants to debate and say that let's progress. And I think there has been some progression, to be fair to both of them. They're far more open to kind of talk about these issues, which they were not. But at the same time, they are multi-billion-dollar enterprises. So it's one change impacts a lot of revenue as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Can I ask you about your third-party verification? I mean, what kind of costs do those support certifications add to your business?
Well, yeah, they do add up, right? So what InMobi does is that, see, unlike other players, we have our SDK, which is a proprietary piece of tech and code, which we put on our publishers. So anybody that we work with as a source of supply and inventory, we have our SDK in them. And that gives us the ability to do a lot of, we can get accurate data, right? The second is that we have our own marketplace system. So if the publisher is doing any kind of click fraud, we have we have a team of 40 engineers trying to do both machine learning as well as curation of these URLs to verify whether this is brand safe, whether the environment is correct, and all that. And the third is that our SDK comes with the ability to render the ad experience, right? So I can fire the ad exactly as the way the viewability definition is, right? So actually, if you look at it, we as an ad tech platform were already following the best practices, right? We had an anti-fraud suite of our own. We had the SDK firing viewable impressions exactly as it should be. Like, for example, we were the first to be measuring everything on rendered impression and not on served impression. So that ability exists. But we can't say that we are doing it unless a third party verifies it.
Exactly.
And that's the reason we are partnered with Moat and IAS on viewability. We are partnered with Nielsen for audience measurement. We have Forensic IQ, which has measured our percentage of traffic, which is invalid traffic, which means that invalid traffic is any machine-based traffic. So our ratios are less than 0.5%. So I think we worked with all these third-party verification providers to make sure that on brand safety, on viewability, on audience verification, and creating a fraud-free marketplace, we come out on top. And we also work with, it's not very well understood, the whole app download space, but there are tracking companies even in that space, like the likes of Kochawa, AppsFlyer, and so on. They do attribution for installs, and we work with them as well on that side to prevent on the app install business. So I think we've done a full stack of verification and being transparent. And you can buy in Mobi through our sales team, or you can buy in Mobi inventory programmatically as well. So it's fully transparent as well.
But it also sounds like for a lot of publishers, for example, the cost of making sure everything is verified is going to be quite exorbitant.
Yeah, I think there's a cost of incorporating these in these technologies into your platform. So yes, it adds to time, and it also adds to investment. I can't quantify how much it is, but I would say it does add 3 to 5% over a period of time.
Right. So I was looking at some stats for ad fraud around this region, and I was surprised to see that Japan was number one. Why is that the case? What makes one market different from another, and how do these, how does fraud exist or perpetuate in certain markets and not in others?
Yeah, so I think it depends on, one, how strong is the third-party verification ecosystem, right? So in Japan, I think there's a lot of homegrown systems, but the global players are not there. It's very difficult for a global player outside of who's doing verification to enter there. So there were homegrown solutions. The second is that Japan is still very mobile web heavy instead of in-app. So I think in web you can do a lot more, I would say, ingenuity to do click fraud. So I think that still exists.
For all the entrepreneurs out there.
Yeah. So I think, those two are the main reasons. I feel a slightly closed ecosystem, and the fact that it's still very web dominant still.
And India came up as an interesting case for fraud on video. And what makes India a different ecosystem again?
So I feel, so one is that video advertising has become in some markets almost 50 to 60% of display advertising, right? And people see a big gold mine of opportunity there, both for right things and the wrong things. So I think the size of the video advertising market has meant that there's a lot more people entering to do fraud in that. And it's also because the CPMs are higher, right? So the percentage that you kind of clip because of is also higher. I think India, because there's also been an explosion of video inventory in India, because of the entry of new telecom operators like Reliance Jio. So I think that has created a glut of inventory, and there's also wide fragmentation of the ecosystem because Android is still the dominant platform. So I think there's more scope, and there's a lot of sharing of content on a P2P basis. So I think all of that could contribute towards the higher incidence of video fraud in India.
Makes sense. Any questions from the floor? Rashad?
Jayesh, I was just wondering whether you see ad fraud as a social problem or a technological problem. In that if I came to it by myself, I think I'm all right.
Okay.
If I came to it by myself, would it be easier for me to commit ad fraud without you knowing because of the technology available to me? Or is it really a social issue?
So if I could repeat the question so that the guys at the back can hear. If I'm getting it correct, you're asking what is the responsibility of the consumer when they stumble on an ad? Like what can they do? Are they responsible for perpetuating this ecosystem?
No, actually, I mean the advertiser.
Okay.
Is it a social or technological issue?
Right.
I think it's a mix of a lot of things, right? And it's kind of a very complex problem. So there is a lot of click spamming, right? You must have seen something which looks like an ad or something which looks like an infomercial, and you click on it and it just goes to a page which is full of random links, right? So I think somewhere the user will get aware that, okay, after clicking on such things for 5 or 10 times, they know that this is probably phony content. But as of now, there's also a lot of talk about fake news, because there's a lot of fake news which is created through such clickbait mechanisms. But I think ad fraud is a very, people are motivated, right? The people who are doing ad fraud want to make money, right? Just like the phishing scams or those kind of things. It is an organized industry, right? People have put click farms. They have put things to spoof a domain. They have done things to create malformed device IDs. So that requires a lot of work. So you need to be determined to do fraud, right? And you need to stay on top of it at a technological level for you to kind of beat some of the sensing mechanisms that people like InMobi or anyone else puts in, because we have deployed 45 engineers just to tackle this, right? And it's a daily problem. You fix something, something else happens, right? And so I think it's more about it's a menace, and it needs to be curtailed, and it's very determined menace, right, for people who are doing it. There are a lot of accidental issues which happen, which people may not know because they don't know, right? So as I said, I think the fundamental issue I feel is that people are bucketing everything into one bucket. Oh, there's some fraud, right? But what is it, right? Is it because, as I said, maybe I'm repeating myself, is it that it's an app install fraud? Is it click spamming? Is it just wrong app? People mix up the whole thing, right? But ad fraud is very separate. It means somebody very determined is spoofing or creating an instance of something which they were not supposed to do, right? And advertisers need to be aware, users need to be aware, and ad blocking won't solve it either.
I like that you referenced fake news, because I think there are a lot of parallels, for both. And you're definitely right in saying that this is an organized effort by a number of people out there to basically milk what is an economic model.
Yeah.
I know the news industry has a hard time figuring out how to curtail that. What can the advertising industry do on its side, to stop that, if at all?
Well, so I'm not an expert on the news industry, but I think there is this challenge about, see, look at it this way. If you are a very big publisher like a Guardian or any of those large names, right? Firstly, you're dependent on traffic from social and other sources. So there's a huge dependence on traffic generation from various sources. Secondly, their business model is at a severe constraint, right? Because they are not making money from advertising. They have huge editorial teams,
right.
And people really don't care about whether people like users, especially millennials, don't stick to that news brand. They are on Twitter. They are on all kinds of social media. So I think that's a bigger challenge. And to me, like Facebook mobile advertising is a $40 billion business. So there's obviously somebody who's going to put news out there and do clickbaiting, right? I feel that it's more about the publishers investing in their own brands so that there is there's a user base which goes to those sources to find the information and the news that they want. And it's also about more curation happening, right? Today, if you take the OTT industry as a parallel, right? There's a lot of UGC content on YouTube, right? And then there is Netflix. But now in Southeast Asia, you also have Hook as a platform. You have View as a platform. There are a lot of platforms which are doing video aggregation, right? But there are only few companies which have done news aggregation really well. But the leading players are also struggling, like Flipboard is struggling, right? So who does that in the news aggregation space? And who creates that curation model, which is going to be very well differentiated? And there are players who are trying to do it. There's Smart News in Japan. There is News Hunt in India, where I think you need more curated news aggregators which have the trust of the user. And the dependency on other social media where anybody can put in something as a news item needs to go down. Right? Unless that happens, I don't see fake news going away because that platform exists, people will abuse it.
That's interesting. I think it sounds like you're also saying that newsrooms or the news industry have to create a premium service which would then be brand safe for advertisers as well.
Yes and no. I think first is their own brand and getting users hooked onto the editorial content that they have. But I think there's a room for news aggregation platforms, just like you have video aggregation or video where, today on Netflix, it's completely curated experience for you. But on news, there is no curated experience. And it's more complex as a problem, right? Because news is so diversified. And so I think that just requires more muscle from somebody who wants to do it.
Right. Other questions? Right over there. If you could shout or wait for the microphone.
Thanks. Just covering something that you both said. Alan started the whole talk off by saying that this isn't anything new. We've been here for 10, 15, 20 years with ad fraud. And then Jayesh, you have brought up that you are looking to future-proof. You've got 40 kind of engineers making sure that what's coming next is stopped. What is coming next? What is the future of the dark side of mobile advertising?
I would say the bright side. I would really want to believe that because,
So things are going to get better.
Yeah, because I think, phishing scams and, all these, just like you have various kinds of internet fraud, we need to, I mean, they will always be at it. There will be players who are unscrupulous and they want to keep doing it. And there will be new things which will come up. But I feel that the industry has moved a certain, it has taken a step function jump. And that is because advertisers have finally started to understand advertising in detail, right? I mean, today I feel the biggest challenge is that marketeers don't invest enough time to understand the medium, right? And probably they don't have the time. And maybe they get a very, fragmented view from the players that they work with, right? Or they get a singular view. Both are very bad for the industry, right? When I say singular view, maybe they just know Google or Facebook's view, or they may know the agency's view. But they've never come and spoken to players like us who are there in the industry, right? So I feel the more progressive marketeers, if you take the mobile-first companies like e-commerce players, they have understood the medium very well of mobile advertising because that is directly linked to their revenue. Today, if there are more app downloads for a Grab or an Uber, the more revenues they make. So they have understood the entire value chain really well on how, right from an impression to an install, that whole chain is mapped in their head. And what are all the breakpoints and where are the incidences of fraud or even anything coming up. So I feel it is more about advertisers progressing towards that knowledge and how we can enable them with that knowledge, right? Because, look, I'll give you many examples, right? I have gone to advertisers who are working with players who are doing fraud, but they don't know it. And they don't know the extent of the problem. For them, today there are hundreds of players claiming to be an ad network. So somebody says, hey, I can deliver you cheaper. So people want to experiment. But why experiment so much, right? Especially, so I think the industry is in a peculiar problem. There's a lot of people who want to experiment, but there is also so there is dominance at one end, of the two players of Facebook and Google. And there's a huge fragmentation at the next level. And the publishers cannot do much about it either, right? You can't name a singular publisher like a FT or anyone who can change the ecosystem because it's all localized and it's so fragmented. So I feel that advertiser education is the key to solve for making sure that the dark side doesn't prevail. And then third-party verification and tools of the trade. Like you will find advertisers saying, yes, I want to stop all this, but I will not invest money in that tool, which is important to solve for it. Then the industry cannot go forward.
So if you could put your consultant hat back on, right? And
Yeah.
As you say, advertisers can't tell the difference. They don't know what they're walking into. So for the marketers in this room, what's your advice for them? So how do you figure out whether you can trust an ad network or not?
So I think I would give them a few questions to ask, right? First is ask the network, how are they sourcing their users? Is it, what is their way to say that I have an audience or I have a, certain amount of, go beyond the, fact that somebody has some inventory. Go behind their, and understand how they have got that audience or traffic. Are they buying programmatically? Do they have their own supply? Do they have things like the SDK, which is an addressable system? Second is, what is the verification partners they have worked with? And ask them to show results of those verification partners. And the third, I would say, and it may be a biased view, is that there's a world outside of Google and Facebook. So, you can't be so dependent on one part of the ecosystem to tell you what to do. Whether it's the agency, whether it is the duopoly, you need to figure out what is your user journey, right? You need to figure out your data and tech, right? And look, there can be users at one. There are three parts to this equation, right? So one is where is your consumer? And that has a link to the audience, right? So you need to figure out, is your audience on Facebook or is it on some other news app, which is probably where they are? You never know, right? So one is to ask that question about where is your audience. The second is that what is the data and tech available to reach that audience, right? And the third is about, is this sustainable, right? You might do one random innovation, make a very shiny toy, but is it sustainable and scalable, right? You want to work with partners who are not going to practically so many companies have folded and got acquired by some of the firms, right? So is this scalable and sustainable, right? You want, I think, that scalability and sustainability to be there for the next 2 to 3 years. So if you're doing something, do that for that scale, right? You might, and that comes back to that equation people use, right? 70, 20, 10. So 70% is what you've always done. 20% you believe you did last year worked for you, and so you're doing more of it. Yeah. And 10% is pure innovation, right? But what is happening in the industry today is that 70 and 20 are in two platforms, and that 10 is across 50 platforms. So there is no scale for learning itself. Forget ROI, and forget cleaning the industry, right? So it's kind of, this model needs to change at that fundamental media mix level for it to kind of make sure that the industry changes. And so I think my message to marketeers is to ask as many questions as on these three domains: the audience-based, what data and tech, and is this partner going to be there in the next 3 years, right? You don't want to work with partners who are fly by night. I think that three parts are important.
Fantastic. Other questions? I thought there was one over there. No? Dean?
Hi, Dean Carroll from Umbrella Asia again. Just wanted to ask you, there have been a lot of references during your dialogue to Goobook or Gooface, whatever we want to call the duopoly. Who are the new players emerging that have volume, that have mass, that will join that crowd? Are we talking about Amazon really taking this on, or are we talking about Alibaba and Tencent? How do you see the next 5 to 10 years playing out in this particular space?
Okay, that's a good question. Definitely Amazon would be one of them. I feel there are attempts, like for example, Verizon has created Oath by acquiring, like telcos have started Every telco has tried to be that third force by acquiring media and tech assets. I think it's a good attempt, but they don't understand the space that well, right? And they are not geared for extracting that revenue. I feel publishers won't be able to do it, for sure. Singular publishers can't do it. I feel there will be room for, I feel there's room for the enterprise players to do it because they can create that equal space for everyone, like Adobe or those kind of players. So there will be room for two enterprise-grade players, right? Whether it's Adobe or Oracle, who manage the entire marketing infrastructure for a large advertiser. That is possible. And I do believe InMobi will be there. We have been there for 10 years. We are profitable. We are independent. I really think we have a good chance of being there. We reach the same scale as, like we reach 1.5 to 1.7 billion users on mobile. And there will be 2-3 companies of our scale. You will also find a very different ecosystem coming up from China, which already exists, right? Alibaba, Baidu, and Tencent. They would be there in some shape or form. You will also find commerce companies becoming like there will be Amazon equivalents in many markets who can probably run a media business. So I would say it's a very tough question, the 5 to 10 years. But I think we are still solving for problems which should have been done a long time back, right? Today, scalability will come in to players only if there is enough faith that there is a need for a third alternative, right? Today, people seem to be comfortable with the fact that there is no need for it, or it is too complex to make it happen. And it is too complex for even the companies who are wanting to play there to make it happen. And I think that's where the challenge is, because there's no clear winner in the third. So my belief is that there will be 3, 4, and 5. There will be some commerce-linked players. There will be room for tech platforms who are enterprise grade. There will be a couple of DSPs who might get there when advertisers are, and for them to get there, advertisers need to be very sure that they don't want to work with agency, but directly work with the DSP and give them the control over their media dollars. So there are a lot of dependencies, but I think there will be that 5, 6 different players, but not one, single player who can do it alone. So I think we need that number to be 6, is my personal view.
So when you look at a market like, say, Indonesia that's getting on programmatic for the first time, what kind of lessons do you have for agencies, marketers in that market, so that they don't make the same mistakes that the other markets have made with programmatic advertising?
So people think programmatic is some magic wand. Like if you do everything programmatically, everything happens smoothly. Firstly, it's not that automated, right? So it requires a lot of people investment, a lot of understanding of how inventory works. So I would say enter it from that angle, that it's not fully automated. The second is that programmatic works really well when you have done sufficiently scalable advertising before. So for example, if you have not done enough experimentation, if you have not done enough learning on what audience segments work for you, your programmatic might fail, right? Yeah, I think these 2 would be the main advice. But I would say that some markets like Indonesia are going programmatic much faster than I thought.
Great. Okay, with that, we'll wrap this up. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah,
Really
no
enjoyed
problem.
the chat.
Thank you.
Thanks.